Welcome everyone to another iteration of our summer series, Managing Through Crisis, presented by Michigan State University's Broad College of Business. My name is Marcie Stowell, the Assistant Director of Executive Development at MSU. Today, we are discovering how to manage strategic messaging during crises. So first, Dr. Shawn Turner will share his insights with you. And second, I will share your questions with him. So please use the Q&A feature on your phone or your device or your laptop to submit your questions throughout the presentation. We will present as many of those as we have time to Dr. Turner during the second half of the presentation today. And actually today we have 40 minutes for Q&A. So if you do have a question, please do submit them. We'll have time for several more than we typically do. So after we conclude today, we'll provide you a link to a recording of the webinar, which will be posted on the Broad YouTube channel. And now I would like to introduce Dr. David Freyer, the Assistant Dean of Outreach and Engagement. I am fortunate to work in one of Dave's units and have learned a lot from him about organizational communication already. So Dr. Freyer, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your continued support of the summer series.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcie, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing organizing and driving this process. It's been a wonderful, fantastic series. We're really grateful for the efforts you've put in. I'd like to welcome everybody today on behalf of Dean Gupta and the entire Broad College. Really pleased that you've taken time to join us for Managing Through Crisis Summer Series. This is a great outreach initiative that we have as a college, trying to stay connected with all of you as we navigate through these somewhat uncharted waters that we've all been experiencing. I'm really pleased today to welcome Dr. Shawn Turner. Shawn is a professor of strategic communication in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences here at Michigan State University. He's a fantastic wealth of knowledge and experience, a frequent contributor on national security communications for CNN and a variety of other sources. He's really going to talk to us today about strategic communication issues and how we can really deal with some of these things at a more strategic level. And I think what's exciting about that is this is, for many of us, an opportunity to step back and really reflect on what we've done in the past and what we're doing today and what we should be doing in the future. And so if any of you as individuals or any of you as organizations want to explore these topics and ideas further, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to engage in a conversation and see how we can bring the resources of Michigan State University to bear on the challenges that you may be having either as individuals or as organizations. And so with that, Dr. Turner, welcome. Really glad that you're here today and look forward to hearing from you.
Well, David, thank you very much. And thank you to Marcie and the entire team over at Broad for the invitation. As you said, David, this is such an important topic. And I want to welcome everyone who's out there listening. Thank you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to sharing some ideas, talking a little bit about some of your experiences and taking your questions. I really do want to make this a discussion today about this really important topic, because I think that in some way, if you're here, you're listening, you're attending, in some way, this issue is relevant for you. In fact, I think it's relevant for every organization out there that's kind of struggling to deal with these unusual times that we're going through. As Marcie said, I want to keep most of this for questions, but this is a topic that I can talk about all day. So I'll try to keep it to 20 minutes. Bear with me if I go over just a little, but when we get into talking about these things, there's so many new ideas and so many tried and true ideas that I want to touch on out there that I want to be absolutely sure that we cover some of these really important topics. I'm going to start out with an opening proposition here. My opening proposition is direct, it's straightforward, and it's very matter of fact. I would say that effective strategic messaging has never been more important to you and your organizations as it is at this moment in time. If you do it well, it can be one of the things that will help your organization get through challenging times. It can help your organization survive what we're going through right now as a nation, as a world. If you don't do it well, it will be one of those factors that will contribute to the struggles that your organization has. Now, for every organization, that's been true at one time or another. But in this particular time, what we're understanding about the way that people are digesting information, the way they're receiving and internalizing information, makes effective strategic messaging more important than ever. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the tried and true tactics that have worked for organizations for a very long time, but we're also going to touch on some of the new strategies that organizations are using. And what I really want to do is I want to spend some time focusing on some of the things that organizations really should avoid doing in terms of developing effective strategic messaging. So with that, again, I want to thank everyone for being here, and we're going to go ahead and dive in so that we can get to your questions. Just a very brief agenda for today. I will have the presentation, and then we'll have the 40-minute Q&A. And then, as Marcie said, if you can please submit your questions, that would be great. We're going to move on to my specific agenda for what we're going to talk about. Any discussion about strategic messaging has to start with a quick refresher on the characteristics of the crisis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but what I see as I work with organizations out there today is I see organizations that are doing the right thing and being prepared for a crisis. But organizations tend to be a little fast off the blocks today with regard to declaring issues crises. And so what I want to talk about today is I want to make absolutely sure that everyone understands that we have crises, but we also have a number of communication issues and challenges that don't rise to the level of crisis. And we need to manage those a different way. So we'll do a quick refresher on the characteristics of a crisis. We're going to define crisis communication and what strategic messaging means in the context of crisis communication. Again, a lot of terms that are thrown around out there today. It's really important that within your organization, you understand the distinctions here, because what you need to be able to do more than anything is to know when to push which buttons in terms of a response to particular issues. So we're going to delve into that a little bit more. The meat of this discussion, the fundamental keys to success in strategic messaging. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've done for years, some of the things that research tells us are the right things to do. But again, we're also going to talk about some of those new strategies and tactics that work really well for organizations. We're going to talk about some often overlooked keys to success in strategic messaging. There are several things that organizations do that are not the things you're going to find in books. They're not the kind of things that you're going to find in research. But just from an interpersonal perspective, we know that they work, and they can work not just between individuals, but they can work across organizations. So we'll touch on some of those things. And then we'll finish up with some pitfalls to avoid before we get to your discussion and questions. All right. So as I said, we're going to do a very brief review of the characteristics of a crisis. Let me just tell you, the reason that I do this is because we need to make absolutely sure that when an event happens in our organization and we have our crisis communication team there and poised to go, and if we've done what we need to do to prepare for a crisis, we've got a crisis communication team with people on that team who understand their various roles, including strategic messaging. But we need to know how to recognize when it's time to launch that team. So when we talk about crises, we obviously have the sudden crisis. This is the one that requires an immediate response, and it requires efforts toward recovery and often occurs from external threats. Okay, these are the unpredictable, sort of unexpected things. They can happen anytime. As it says, there are a high degree of instability and the potential for extreme negative results. These are the kinds of things where you have, you find out that a CEO has been embezzling money. There is a major design flaw in a vehicle that's causing fires in the vehicle. There's a natural disaster that shuts your business down for several weeks or several months. These things happen suddenly, they're unexpected, and there's the chaos of not knowing what to do. So those are pretty clear, those sort of sudden crises that we've all experienced, we all see about it under, above the breaking news ticker on television. The more challenging sort of crisis is the smoldering crises. This is the gradually building crisis with the potential, where there's the potential for it to be controlled, but you don't get to it early enough. These start small, they become public, and they can escalate to a crisis, but they don't always have to. If we just think about what we're going through right now with COVID-19, you think about the amount of information that we had when the virus was first identified, and what various nations did, and what we did here in the United States, and what people did around the world. in terms of recognizing that there was this threat that was growing over time, until you get to the point where you are in a crisis state. It was a smoldering crisis, not typical in terms of what we see in organizations, but none of this is typical. In organizations, we see issues like what Starbucks is dealing with right now, with issues of race and various issues involving intolerance within the organization. They've had a smoldering crisis for some time that they're trying to deal with now. We have other organizations where you have sort of open secrets about things in the organization that are not going well. These are considered the smoldering crisis and things that need to be dealt with. I want to give you that perspective because the way that we develop our strategic messages depends heavily on whether or not we have a sudden crisis, a smoldering crisis, or we simply have a communication issue that we need to deal with. So it's important that we understand those distinctions. And I'll talk about these distinctions a little more as we go through this. So what is strategic messaging? Well, I think in order to talk about strategic messaging, we first have to start with the umbrella term. We're going to start with crisis communication. So let's define crisis communication here. So crisis communication is an umbrella term. It includes the collection, the collection and dissemination of information required to effectively address a crisis. It encompasses the process for determining what the organization says to employees, media, the public, customers, other stakeholders in response to that negative event. Now, the reason I put this up here is because I want you to understand that in your organizations, the crisis communication team should include people who are skilled at strategic messaging. That team will include people who are skilled at dealing with the press, people who are skilled at dealing with talking with people in social media, people who are skilled in dealing with people with your internal audiences. But you also need someone who's skilled in developing strategic messaging. Those people will develop strategic messaging for all of those different channels and for all of those different circumstances. So with that in mind, what do we mean when we talk about strategic messaging? Well, strategic messaging is the content. It encompasses the content of communications determined to be necessary in an organization's crisis communication plan. Important here, it is a value-based approach to communications that organizations and leaders employ in those interactions with the stakeholders that I talked about under the crisis communication definition. So I really want you all to think about this in terms of we hear these terms: strategic messaging, strategic communication, crisis communication. When it comes to strategic messaging and strategic communication, feel free to use those terms interchangeably. Either term is fine. But when we talk about crisis communication, what I really want you to think about is the idea that crisis communication is the umbrella term, and within your crisis communication team, your crisis communication plan, you have people who engage in strategic messaging. Now, before we go on, one other caveat to this. Strategic messaging is something that happens in your organization, whether you're going through a crisis or not. Okay, I always tell organizations that it's great that I help them develop a crisis communication team, and we really focus on what that team should do and how that team should function. But you have lots of communication issues where you need strategic messaging. There are organizations, you all represent some organizations right now that are doing a fine job of dealing with the challenges that we're facing as a result of COVID-19. Part of the reason you may not be sensing or feeling like you're in a crisis right now, and part of the reason that you're not is because you're doing a good job of developing effective strategic messages that are connecting with your customers, with people who support you, with your stakeholders. So I want to be clear that strategic messaging during times of crisis is really important. It's what we want to focus on today, but you should always be doing strategic messaging to manage those communication issues that arise. Okay, I'm going to keep moving here because 20 minutes goes fast. So what are some of the fundamental keys to success when it comes to strategic messaging? I'm going to go through some of the things that I've been teaching organizations to do for years. Some of these things, you're going to look at them and they're going to say, look, Shawn, that's a no-duh. Of course those things work. What I want you to do is I want you to think about these things in your organization, and in terms of your own leadership, think about the opportunities that you take to do these things, because while these things seem fairly straightforward, I can't tell you how often I fail to see these things being put into practice in organizations. But I'll give you some examples as we get into the discussion of how well these things work. I have to say personal is powerful. You know, during times of crisis, messages in most cases need to come from real people within organizations. Now, that's not to say that you don't have organizational statements that you put out during times of crisis. But what it is to say is that within your organization, when you have stakeholders, you have supporters, you have customers who are concerned about what's happening, they want to hear from people who they feel like they can make a connection with. So in your organizations, spokespersons are a good idea. However, I will say that your main responsibility when it comes to personal being powerful and connecting with people on a person-to-person level, your main responsibility is to find the right person in your organization who can make that connection. Before I'll go on, I'll say, people are often surprised to hear me say this, the CEO is not always, in fact, often not the right person to make that personal connection with all of your audiences. So you need to do that assessment to figure out who in our organization, based on the crisis that we're dealing with, the issue that we're dealing with, who in our organization is best poised to really be able to connect with our target audience. Personal is powerful. Communicating often. Look, just because you've said it once doesn't mean that the job is done. From a communication perspective, you need to understand, we have to understand that communication relieves anxiety. It reassures audiences during times of crisis. I tell people that, you know, making sure that that spokesperson or the person you've designated as your face of the organization needs to be out there in my living room, in my social media feeds, in my email. They need to be talking to me often on a regular basis. That gives me a sense, that gives me the sense that the organization understands what we're going through. It gives me the sense that the organization cares about the challenges that we're confronting, and it helps me make a connection that makes me feel loyal to the organization. You know, I can't tell you this. I harp on this more than anything. You know, in organizations, oftentimes, sometimes because of limited resources, and sometimes just because people don't understand the importance, we need to know our audience. And what I mean when I say knowing our audience, what I'm really getting at here is that even if you're looking at a customer base, or you're looking at supporters or investors, I encourage you to look deeper into that particular segment of your audience to understand whether or not you have sub-audiences, whether or not you need to communicate with people a little differently based on what their interests are. I will tell you that when I worked in the intelligence community as Director of Communication for U.S. National Intelligence, I would identify various groups that I needed to communicate with, and my messaging, in order to get them to the same place, my messaging may take a different route. I may use different wording, or I may focus on a different aspect of the issue that we're talking about, because I know it's important to that particular group. Now, understanding, I can't emphasize this enough. You're trying to get everyone to the same place. You're trying to keep everyone engaged, and you're trying to create that sense of trust, and loyalty, and credibility. But you may have to go different routes to get there. So know your audience. As I say there, it's, you know, you always have more than one. So make sure to communicate communicate to the concerns of different groups in the right channels and under the right circumstances. And again, you know, this would be your communication team sitting down and using the tools that are available to you to make sure that you understand exactly who those people are, where they get credible information, what they care about, and what they find persuasive. It's difficult to be visible during these unusual times. You know, I'm a big advocate of managing and messaging by walking around. Now, that term walking around typically deals with internal communication, but I want to be clear here that when I talk about managing and messaging by walking around, this also relates to those audiences outside of your organization. I would always encourage leaders within organizations to take unusual routes to reach out to key stakeholders. Sometimes that's, you know, if you have key stakeholders who are on a call, I would always have leaders in the organization drop in on a call that no one expected them to be on. I would have leaders reach out in various forms directly to stakeholders. Being visible at times when people don't expect you to be visible really builds a sense of trust, makes people feel as though you care about what they're doing. You're aware of what they're doing and their interests beyond simply how they engage with the organization. As with what we're going right now, with everyone being engaging through a computer screen, I would encourage you to use not only live, but recorded messages to supplement emails and social media posts. We've done this at MSU, where we have the president of the university doing live town halls, but we also record videos and make sure that those are available to students, faculty, family members throughout this event. You've heard this before. Get personal. Don't be afraid to show emotion, because it can reveal real authenticity. There are some great examples of leaders and organizations going through COVID-19, coming on via video and talking to people and talking about, from the heart, about what it's doing to those organizations and what those organizations are committed to with regard to keeping their stakeholders at the front of mind. Okay, so don't be afraid to get personal. These are some very just sort of fundamental keys to success when it comes to strategic messaging. I want to talk a little bit more about these as we get into the questions, but I think these are sort of tried and true methods that will work. Being honest and candid, always tell the truth. It promotes optimism. One of the things I really want to encourage you to embrace here is that the idea that people really can't handle the truth. One of the things we typically do in crisis communication and strategic messaging is we try to figure out how to say things in ways that take the sting out a little bit, to say things in ways that will allow to give us a little bit more time, give us a little bit of space until things change. I will tell you that lots of research indicates that actually doesn't work as well as we always thought it did. Look, what people want more than anything is they want you to stand up in front of them. They want you to look them in the eye, and with all earnestness and with authenticity, they want you to tell them what the situation is, and they want you to tell them what you're going to do about it. And they want to, if an organization's struggling, they would much rather feel as though we're struggling together, as opposed to feeling as though the organization may be struggling, but people are not telling me what's happening in the organization. This is very difficult for people to kind of wrap their minds around, for leaders to wrap their mind around, for communication professionals to get behind. But the research is there. It tells us that this makes people feel more engaged and more loyal to the organization, and it gives people a sense of affiliation with the organization. Okay, so fundamental keys to success. We're going to move through here quickly because I think we're probably already over my 20 minutes. We are just a couple of minutes. So I'm going to get through the messaging, or the often overlooked keys to success in strategic messaging. Oftentimes when you're developing strategic messages, particularly when you're dealing with a crisis, there's a core group of people who are working with you to develop those messages. Your core crisis communication team. They are in the line of fire. They're the people who are going to be criticized, the people who are going to take all the incoming. As leaders, you've got to take care of that team. I will tell you that the real challenge here is that oftentimes people on that team, they're going to be missteps. People are going to make mistakes. If someone on that team makes a mistake, there'll be a time for dealing with what happened, for accountability. But in the midst of the crisis, as leaders, we've got to take care of that core team, because it's that core team that's going to allow us to be able to continue to effectively manage the crisis. So take care of your core team of crisis communicators, even when they make mistakes. You've got to stick with it. Elicit and act on feedback. This is not just from your core team, but from all the people that you're communicating with, all those you're messaging. You've got to take some time to go out and check what I call temperature checks, to see how your messaging is playing, see how people are feeling about the organization, about how you're handling the crisis. Make sure that you get that feedback directly from people and take it back to your team. Sit down and ask, hey, we're hearing this. Sit down and ask what you need to do to adjust. One of the biggest mistakes that organizations make when it comes to crisis communication is not spending enough time and effort on that back end, making absolutely sure that you're adjusting to that you're making adjustments to what you're actually dealing with. Okay, don't be afraid to share the stage. This is a really important one. Oftentimes leaders in organizations take it on themselves to be the people who need to deliver strategic messaging. I'm a big believer in ambassadors of strategic messaging. This may be difficult early on, simply because you're still in the process of developing messaging and making sure that people are delivering those messages in a way that's consistent with your values. But at some point, there will be opportunities for people to speak on behalf of the organization. You've got to be willing to share the stage with those people and allow those people to talk about their experience in dealing with the organization. I'll give some examples as we get into the questions on this. But when I was in the intelligence community and Edward Snowden took all of our stuff and went to China and then off to Russia, one of the most effective strategies I used to help with young people who were looking at the intelligence community and and shocked and believing everything that Edward Snowden was saying is I took students, like the students who had just been on campus here at MSU and other campuses around the country, and those students were in the intelligence community now. They had graduated. Well, I grabbed those students and I said, we're going to send you back to your campus. You're in the intelligence community now. You know what we do. You know how we do it. I'm going to send you back to your campus, and you go back and you talk to people who you may have been in class with just 2 years ago. I put them on stage with the Director of National Intelligence and allowed for leaders to share the stage with people who were just starting out in their career. So don't be afraid to share the stage during times of crisis. Schedule a few surprises. What I mean there is, you're going to have a crisis communication plan. You're going to have your messaging. It's going to be ready to go. Take some time to do some things that are a little out of the box. One of the things that I would often do during times of crisis within my organization is if I had people who were doing a really great job, I'd sit down and I'd handwrite a letter. I'd write a letter to, I had a couple of young kids who were computer techs who had done a great job. I wrote a letter to their mom, just telling them how great it was to have them as part of the team. Buying lunch for your team or organization, giving people time off. Look at those things that you can do in your organization that surprise people. When it comes to your customer base, the same sort of thing. Every once in a while, if there's an opportunity to do something that surprises your customer base, surprises your supporters, don't be afraid to do that because it really does work. Lastly, institutionalize the good stuff. What I mean here is that as you go through a crisis and you develop messaging and you make decisions that are going to show people how engaged and how much you care about the issues you're dealing with, you're going to come up with some really good ideas. The one thing I want to encourage you to do is when the crisis is over and when you've successfully managed the crisis, don't necessarily look to table those things, to stop those things. We all learn things about ourselves and our organizations as we deal with crisis. And we learn how to do things better. And as we learn how to do things better, sometimes it's a good idea to just keep doing those things even after the crisis is over. Okay. And again, I've already touched on this. Save the accountability for later, especially if it's a core team member. So we don't need to hit on that again. All right. So I think that that's it for the portion of this where I'm going to be talking to you. What I really want to do is get to your questions. Several other things I want to touch on, but I'll try to tie those into some of the questions as we get going here. So Marcie, if I can turn it over to you, if we have some questions, I'd love to get the discussion going.
Yes, let's get going. You have really expanded a lot of mindsets here, including my own. So we have many questions and we are encouraging you. We have 32 minutes to share questions today. So if you have them, submit them and we will do our best to organize them and present them to Dr. Turner. So let's get going. The first is about how messages resonate. So the viewer says, people seem especially susceptible now, considering large amounts of uncertainty, trusted sources communicating more frequently, and increased exposure to many sources of information. What do you suggest organizations do to ensure that their strategic messaging is resonating correctly or genuinely with their target audience?
Yeah, I love this question. It is a great question. And I'll just give a little bit of context before I dive into this, because it really does highlight a challenging issue for communication professionals. Prior to the period of time where we begin to talk about misinformation and disinformation, and prior to COVID-19, we were seeing trends in marketing and advertising and persuasive messaging that told us that that particularly as, you know, as humans, but particularly as Americans, one of the things that was happening was that we were becoming hyper aware of the fact that people, organizations were always messaging us. You know, if you go back and I love studying marketing and advertising in the 50s and 60s. You know, you go back and you watch some of those commercials and those messages, and you know, people would tell you, you know, it works great for this, and people would go, wow, it works great for that, and that's all it took. But that hyper awareness that we're constantly being messaged actually makes it more difficult for organizations to develop effective strategic messages. So what do you do when that's happening? Well, a couple of things. One, when it comes to the tried and true characteristics of persuasive messaging, those things still work, but they have to work in a way where people really don't feel like they're being messaged. I'll just give you one example that may get you thinking. It's difficult to do something like this, but you know, I worked on a project called Insightful Strangers, where we developed strategic messaging that where we wanted people to go to a particular website and to learn more about a particular topic. And the way that we did that is we basically messaged people without knowing they were messaged. They were messaged by an overheard conversation. They were messaged by two people sitting down and having a conversation where they initially established their credibility through talking to each other. And then they talked about how great this information was and how you really should, they told each other, you really, you know, one person told the other person, you really should take a look at this. And what we found is when people overheard that message, when they overheard that conversation, they found that persuasive because people had established their credibility and they had and then they had said that something was good. And so we found that other people who heard that conversation were then seeking out that information. The reason we did that is because we were trying to figure out if there was a way to do a better job of messaging and where people did not feel like they were being messaged. What that and other research taught us is that when we develop strategic messaging, there was one factor and only one factor so far that we know that helps people, you know, feel like they should take action even if they know they're being messaged. And that's through authenticity. Look, you know, the bottom line is that we live in a time now where people are going to recognize you're trying to sell me a car, or you're trying to get me to go on vacation using your company, or you're trying to get me to do something. They get that. And then they're basically saying, now convince me. And the only way that we know that's really working today is through sincere authenticity. Subaru commercials, fantastic. I'm a dad. They did a whole campaign focused on dad-daughter relationships and how dads protect daughters, and how if you have a Subaru, that's part of protecting your daughter. It was authentic. It was real. It's the reason there's a Subaru sitting outside. You know, those sorts of things. So I think that developing messages that move away from you know, things that we've traditionally focused on, like you know, quality and all those other sort of things that people really care about, but in injecting authenticity, injecting the human connection is the most effective way. I would also say, you know, this is a long-winded answer. You've got to, you know, the better we understand our audiences, the more effective messages we can develop. So investing in being able to bifurcate your audiences, get down to that nano level, is going to really help you develop effective messages. So sorry, let me stop there and go to the next question.
It's an excellent segue because I was going to transition into talking about internal and external audiences. So as we think about managing our current crises, there's several different iterations of this question that have come through. Can you speak to what's most important to how we're managing our communications internally?
Yeah. So a couple of things. It's often the case when it comes to organizational crises that there are people in the organization who feel like they are in the midst of the crises, and then there are people who feel like they're in the fringe of the crises. And when they talk about the crises, it's just like they could be talking about it happening in another organization. In this case, and what we're dealing with right now, there's no one in the organization that feels like they're on the fringe of the crisis. Everyone feels like this is affecting me at work and at home and in every aspect of my life. So the most important thing to do in messaging right now, and I'm helping lots of organizations try to do this, the most important thing to do is to make absolutely sure that, look, we have to throw the curtains open on what's happening in organizations and develop messaging that gives people a sense of an honest sense of where the organization is and how the organization is dealing with this crisis, what the organization's plans are. And I tell people to do this in threes. Tell people what you're planning to do tomorrow, tell them what you plan to do next month, and tell them what you plan to do over the next year. Talk to people about, I was at an event recently where I said, you've got to bring people into the boardroom and give them access to those discussions that you don't typically give the mid-level employees access to. And the reason that's important now is because we are all in this together. And we've never had a situation like this before. Bring people behind the curtains. I will also say that, in terms of developing messages, I talked earlier about the need to have that personal connection. There are several organizations that I'm working with right now where we're having people regularly sign up to hear from a spokesperson in that organization who they can have a real relationship with. And sometimes you have hundreds and hundreds of people on these calls, and that person will sit there and will take all the questions. And if they can't answer the question, they'll go back and they'll try to get answers. This is such an unusual situation, Marcie, that we just really have to kind of, as I said, throw the curtain open and communicate with people in a very direct one-to-one sort of level. It's challenging. It's not typical with regards to crisis management, but it's what we have to do in this circumstance.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that comes from that is people hear different things. Yeah. So what recommendations do you have? This viewer is asking on behalf of a manufacturing company. What recommendations do you have? She's using talking points and scripts to convey messaging through supervisors, but the delivery and inflection doesn't always convey the message consistently. So what can she do to equip her supervisors to communicate this message so that it's received more consistently?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, if you're a part of an organization, a large organization, one of the biggest challenges is that you may have multiple different streams of information coming out of that organization. As leaders, that's something we really need to get our arms around during times like this. I encourage people to, if you don't already have a primary source of information, a primary channel with a primary source of information where people know that if there are rumors and innuendo and other things happening on the side, you want everyone in your organization to say, I heard this, but I know I can go here and get the ground truth. If you don't have that already, you've got to create it in your organization. The bigger your organization is, the more streams of communication you're going to have coming out of your organization. And so you've got to have that place where people feel like they can go. And again, when I say if you don't have it, create it. I was at a university recently where we said we created something called Freshman Scoop to deal with all the rumors that happen on campus, among freshmen. And what freshmen would do is they'd say, I heard this, and then people would say, well, what did you check Freshman Scoop? Because that's where the ground truth is. And so you have to create those spaces where, and then you have to push people to those spaces. You have to be genuine in that channel saying, this is where we're going to make absolutely sure we keep you informed about everything that's happening in this organization. Inoculate people, tell people that you understand that they're going to hear rumors and misinformation and other things out there. But if you want the ground truth, come here and look me in the eye and say, I will always give you the truth. I will always keep you up to date and informed on what's going on. So create that space. And then the last thing I'll say on that is just with regard to delivery and making sure those messages are authentic. Look, I think that if organizations need to invest in different things right now, it's important for organizations to make sure that investing in and having those managers be able to effectively deliver those messages is so important right now. If you've got multiple managers talking to their teams and you've got some who are really good and some who are not so good, you're going to have splits in your organization that are going to be problematic. If you have the resources, invest in making sure that those managers who aren't very good can be better. And if not, then stop letting them communicate with people in your organization. This is, as I don't need to say anything, telling you, this is serious business. So if you got people who can't do that well, it's going to have a significant impact.
And what do we do about that? When there's unintended negative consequences, specific to a leadership decision or a communication style, what are the best ways to address that at the next level higher?
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple of things there. First of all, when you recognize that that's happening and you recognize that it's already sort of out there in the ether among your employees or your supporters, your customer base, whatever it may be, you've got to acknowledge up front that if there've been you acknowledge that maybe there's been some information that's been passed or that's been delivered that wasn't the most accurate information, or maybe there's misunderstanding about something. You've got to go to people and acknowledge that directly. People really appreciate that. I've had 2 occasions in my career where I had to go to people and say, we were wrong. Okay, we made a mistake, and here's what we're going to do to fix it. And I will tell you that we lost very few people after we did that, but we were on the path to losing a lot of people before we did that. So make absolutely sure that you're honest and candid about that. The other thing is just, if you've got a crisis communication team, you've got people who are responsible for taking a step back and looking at what's happening in the organization. I would encourage you to get feedback from those people with regard to what's working, what's not working in terms of that outward communication. Again, and I don't say this to be harsh, but I really do believe that if you have streams of communication, channels of communication, and maybe it's a person, maybe it's a division, maybe it's a process that's just not working, you've got to take it offline. Taking it offline and redirecting those processes or people or streams to that same target audience is the best thing that you can do right now. You can deal with why it didn't happen or why you had to take it offline, but you've got to take it offline to do that, to be effective.
What are things we should be considering when looking for that balance between transparency and oversharing, specifically when there's been a negative situation like you've been describing?
Yeah, that's a good question. That balance is difficult. A couple of things. You should always think that whatever you're sharing, as you become more transparent, as you sort of open the curtain of it, always anticipate that information is going to get out beyond the audience that you're targeting. In this day and age, that's almost always the case. And so what I tell people to do is when you're drafting internal messages where you're being more transparent, more open with your employees than you might typically be, and when you're talking about issues that you might not typically talk about in a memo, write that memo with the full expectation that people outside the organization are going to see that memo, that maybe the people in the press are going to see it, or stakeholder or investors are going to see that memo. Go in with that mindset. And so what that allows you to do is it allows you to strike that balance between how transparent you're being, but also anticipating the possibility that it'll get out so that you're not embarrassed, so that you're not, you don't put yourself in a difficult position. This is a very difficult and fine line to walk. That's why I firmly believe that, it's the kind of thing that within organizations you need to do collectively, multiple people involved. But I do think that when that information gets out, and as information gets out, it's really important to make sure that you've got people who can track that information and to give you feedback on a regular basis, on a daily basis, with regard to how that information is playing. What I often remind people of is that if you've got people who in your organization, if you've got employees who are responsible for standing outside your organization, even though they work for you, they stand outside your organization, they stand with the crowd, they stand with your stakeholders, and they look at your organization. And it's their job to get a sense for how the communication from that organization feels if I'm standing here and I'm absorbing it. And they need to feed that information back to you so that you can make adjustments. And it's certainly the case with things like this, that you're trying to be transparent about getting out. If it begins to feel like it's too much from the outside looking in, then you adjust down. But if it's feeling like people aren't, it's not enough, then you can adjust up. But you need that outside perspective looking in.
And there's some extra challenges right now. The expectation is communication right now, in our social media world. And we're dealing with COVID and public health, working from home, social unrest, economic downturn, difficulties at work, and with, personal adjustments to all that. How do we approach that myriad of issues with a good, sound, well-timed strategic plan?
Yeah, I think that within organizations, most organizations understand the crisis communication plan is really important. But I have yet to find an organization that had a crisis communication plan that could have prepared them for what we're going through today.
Uh,
Like crisis communication plans are designed to be, dynamic and updated. I always encourage organizations to have what if sessions where you sit down and as an organization, you bring people together and you say, okay, everything's fine now, but what if this happened? Well, Marcie, I've never sat down in an organization and said, what if there is a global pandemic? What do we do then? So this is uncharted territory for everyone. And so what I've encouraged people to do is to, we talked a little bit about, maybe I did touch on, nested crises. There's this broad crisis that we're going through and it's impacting everything. And within this broad crisis, they're nested or what I call branch crises. We're all trying to deal with COVID-19 and it's in the broad sense, but there are things that are happening in organizations that are the kinds of things that we can deal with in our crisis communication plan. What I encourage organizations to do is to deal with the crises, deal with the nested or the branch crises that you can deal with in your organization. Recognizing that, because everyone, all the stakeholders are going through COVID-19 together, they will still appreciate the fact that you're dealing with those smaller issues within your organization and you're dealing with them in an effective way. So, I worked with a group of hospitals recently and, COVID-19 is the umbrella crisis. But, our crisis when we worked together was the lack of PPE and the lack of ventilators. And so we needed to deal with that crisis as a group of hospitals. And so we pulled out the crisis communication plan and we said, look, what if we have an issue? It's right there in our plan. I encourage organizations to focus on those things at the same time that they're trying to focus on the broader COVID-19 crisis. Those lower level things will keep your stakeholders engaged and committed.
And do you suggest that in general then that each, this viewer, Christy, is asking, do you deliver each message independently or do you consolidate by issue or crises into single communications?
Yeah, it's a great question, Christy. There was a time when I would say, look, figure out, who your target audience is and develop messages that are great for that target audience. Now, what I do is I really do encourage people to develop messages that are messages that you want all of your stakeholders to receive. Messages that are value-based and communicate who you are and what you do and basically make them feel good about your organization. Now, those are the broad messages, but I always encourage people to get deeper. If you've got a particular target audience that is concerned about a particular issue, develop messages for that target audience and bring your team together and talk to your team about how you get those messages in that space. You need to do that across the board, deliver those messages in channels that are right for that target audience. And let me be more specific in terms of what I'm talking about here. When I worked with an organization recently where we knew that we had two very distinct audiences. We had older Americans above the age of 60, and we had a group of young Americans who were mostly busy in social, active in social media. We wanted both of those groups to get to the same place with regard to our messaging, but we knew we could not approach them in the same way. So we developed messages that were not only more effective for younger people, young men primarily, who were in social media, and we put them put the messages in those channels. And we developed messages that were more appropriate for that older crowd. And we put those messages in different channels where they were able to receive them. And that worked quite well. So that's what I mean when I say, think more detailed about your audience and get those messages into those channels. Last thing I'll say on that is there are a lot of tools out there that will really help you do that. If you've got a communication team in your organization, they can go out there and they can find some of the tools that can help you better understand your audience, no matter what organization or what line of work you're in.
So I'm going to bundle a couple questions together. I see some of them are asking, how do we do X, right? And it's tactical. When I think about a quality manager can look at a product and instantly see the 7 things that are wrong with it, or I can look at a class in session, and not at MSU, of course, but I can see, instantly things I would do to improve that class. What do you look at? What are those things you look for when you look at an organization's strategy, so that we can then evaluate our own strategies to see where there's gaps, vulnerabilities?
Sure. One of my favorite terms is, I talk to people about how crisis situations are dynamic and evolving, and organizations are dynamic and evolving. And so crisis communication plans should be dynamic and evolving. So when I look at an organization, your organization today is in a very different place than it was 3 years ago. So I go into organizations, and first of all, I ask a couple of questions. I ask, okay, let me take a look at the crisis communication plan. What I'm looking for in that crisis communication plan is whether or not there is a core crisis communication team packed with people who understand their roles and know exactly what they're supposed to do when a crisis happens. Is there a process for launching the crisis communication team? I look for that sort of ready-made, sort of off-the-shelf infrastructure that I can pull off, I can drop on top of the crisis and say, okay, we're ready to go. And so that's the first thing I look for. When I go into organizations and I'm just assessing whether or not they're ready for a crisis, I want to know how often that crisis plan has been updated. I want to know how engaged those people are. The last organization I worked with, 50% of the people who were on the crisis communication team had left the organization. But I also want to understand the connections that the organization has with its customer base or with its supporters. This is a really important one to me. If you are an organization that that communicates with people through social media, communicates with people through earned media, through direct mail, I want to look at all of those. And what I want to see is I want to see how often people are actually paying attention to your communication. If you're using Salesforce, how often are people opening your emails? How often are people actually showing that they're engaged with your organization? Because that gives me a sense of how effective your communication is. So we often in organizations, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, we often think about how much we communicate out. And we're often very proud of the fact that we've got a lot of different channels communicating out to a lot of different audiences in a lot of different ways. But we fail to stop and ask, how effective are we actually being? How often are those messages actually reaching people, and how much are they engaging with the organization? That's what a guy like me comes in and looks at, because that tells me how loyal they're going to be, how engaged they're going to be when that crisis hits. That tells me if those channels are going to be good to use when that crisis hits. Okay, if you're emailing people every week for of the year, when you have a crisis and people aren't really reading those emails, when you have a crisis, they're not going to suddenly start reading those emails. So I need to do something in that channel to make it more effective. And so I look at those channels and figure out how to do that. All right, I'll leave it there, Marcie.
I am fully immersed in what you're saying and are already considering how to evaluate what we're doing as well. So please continue. I was going to ask you next, do you have some examples where if we're going to go out and look, a company or an organization that has timed it well, that has the right cadence, the right utilization of, the different channels? Do you have some examples?
Yeah, I'll tell you who's doing a great job right now, and you guys would probably throw things at me if you could, but who's doing a great job right now is Google. I worked with a team over at Google a couple of years ago, and they were really focused on making sure. At the time, they were buying up a bunch of smaller companies to allow them to sort of compete with some of the other tech platforms. But they were really concerned about appearing to be something other than what they were, which was a search engine. That's where they wanted to stay. Well, if we've got anybody on from Google, then I didn't invite them to weigh in here. But one of the things that they did really effectively is, for an organization that big, to sort of take a grassroots effort to talk to their employees, their investors, to their supporters about what Google was, what Google stood for, about their values, as they bought all these other companies and branched out in ways that where they saw people were concerned about social media platforms and misinformation and things along those lines. They took a proactive effort to say, we're going to try to wrap our arms around. We're going to put barriers around our space and tell people this is who we are and this is what matters to us and you matter to us. And they did a really fantastic job with that. I can give some more specific examples. I'm a little leery talking about specific companies because I've gotten myself in trouble doing that before. But the other thing I'll say is, Marcie, I'm really happy to talk to anyone on the call offline about challenges that they may be facing and to offer feedback. So I will offer that up as well to be more specific.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for a good example and then offering a resource, as we go forward.
Yeah.
I have two more questions for you, and they're mostly about people.
Okay.
You had something on a slide, and I'm remembering now to ask you, can you please flip back to slide 9? Someone had wanted to see that while you were presenting earlier.
Okay.
One of the, slide 9, yeah, pitfalls to avoid. So one of the things you had mentioned was share the stage.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. How can we prepare those around us to share the stage with us?
Yeah. So one of the questions that organizations often ask is, during times of crisis, do we want people in our organization communicating about the crisis? Do we want people out there delivering our messaging? And that's a tough question to ask, because if you have not prepared people in your organization to be ambassadors for the organization, then you might expect that you're going to have some missteps there. So here's what I tell people when it comes to sharing the stage. Part of your messaging, a strategy, has to be to make sure that people in your organization understand what your organization stands for and understands the values of your organization before the crisis happens. We do this, I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps. We do this in the Marine Corps a lot, where part of the objective is to make sure that people are, the way that people feel about the organization is a way that allows you to feel confident that when they go out and talk about the organization, whether it's talking to a member of the press or whether it's talking to their neighbors at a barbecue, that the way they talk about an organization is a way that is consistent with your messaging. So what I will often suggest people do is oftentimes your communication team in your organization, they're kind of going along and they're doing the day-to-day business, but employ your communication team to make sure that there are people in the organization that as people rise in the organization, that those people are not just getting lessons in, are not just getting trained in sort of the business aspects of your organization, but as they rise, make training them in communication, make training them in strategic messaging part of the requirement, part of what they get as they rise in the organization. This is the kind of thing that it's always surprising to me that organizations don't do this, because it's an easy thing to do. Then when that crisis happens, if you've got somebody who at every level as they've risen up in the organization, somebody who's been trained in strategic messaging, who understands the organization, is committed to the organization, it's easy to share the stage with that person or with those individuals, because they've been part of your value system for the entire time. The last thing I'll say on this very quickly is when we talk about sharing the stage, sometimes the crisis happens and you've just got to do it. Well, this is where the feedback loop works. When you are out there, when you're delivering your strategic messaging and you're getting that feedback, in your organization and with those organizations that work with your organizations, where those opportunities are to share the stage with people. So that's why that feedback is so important. Have your communication people go out there and find out how people are receiving those messages, get those stories and bring those stories back to you, identify those stories, and then bring those people in and say, I understand that this has been your experience. Would you be willing to talk about this? And that's one of the ways that you can get through that successfully.
And I would imagine with all the facets and the multiple crises we have going on right now, that any documented plan following 2020 will cover many more scenarios than a plan that was documented earlier than, the pandemic and all the rest that we've been through.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one point I want to make there is that, I've always had a person who had we refer to it as having the pen. The person who had the pen during my crises is the person who was responsible for writing the next part of the crisis communication plan, so that if this ever happened again, we're prepared. It's almost like a historian in a government organization, someone who documents everything and documents what we do and what works well and what doesn't work well. Because as we all know, if a crisis can happen once, it can happen again. And so you've got to have that person there to do that so that you can capture those lessons.
Yeah, so as we wrap up today, any final thoughts you want to share with us?
Look, I know we've covered, and thank you, Marcie. Yeah, I know we've covered a lot of material, and this is the sort of thing I could talk about for a long time. But I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. Look, strategic messaging and crisis communication is more important to the organization than it's ever been before. What I would encourage everyone here to do is to not only look at what you're doing that's working, look at what you're doing it's not working, but I would encourage you to also talk to other organizations, talk to other communication professionals, talk to me about those challenges that you're having in the organization, because what we're doing right now as leaders, as organizations, as professionals, is we're rewriting the script with regard to how to be successful in managing crises. Some of the old things are going to persist, but there's so many new things, so many new ideas, so many new ways to connect with people that we're going to have to capture. And as we do that, we need to figure out exactly how we share that information and how we make sure that's part of what we always do going forward. So I just want to thank you all for taking time to listen and for the great questions. And again, I'm always available. I'd love to connect with folks at any time to talk more about these issues.
You have been so gracious to give us this time to prepare. Thank you very much for doing that. Thank you for serving our country for 21 years. And for those of you watching, thank you for coming and for engaging with MSU. So we wish you well, stay safe and healthy as we go through these times. Take care.